The first pale light of dawn broke over the jagged cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, as Sergeant William Peterson stared in disbelief at what lay before him. The 27-year-old Minnesota farm boy, now squad leader with Dog Company, 2nd Ranger Battalion, had just witnessed the impossible. 18 German machine gun nests, strategically positioned to rain death upon the American landing forces below, now lay silent. What Peterson and his 7-man squad had accomplished in less than 50 minutes had been deemed suicidal by 3 separate commanding officers. The technique they employed, officially discouraged during training as too dangerous, had just saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. As dawn fully illuminated the churning waters below, Peterson wiped the blood from his wire cutters and whispered to his radio man, "Tell command the guns are silent. I repeat, all 18 machine gun positions neutralized." What the young sergeant witnessed that morning defied 2 years of intelligence assessments about German defensive capabilities. In his hands he held 300 feet of spent copper wire, a crude battery pack, and the shattered remains of a modified field telephone, improvised tools that had just delivered the Rangers their first decisive victory on the longest day. The journey that brought Peterson and his squad to this precarious position on the Norman coastline had begun 18 months earlier in the cold, rain-swept training grounds of Scotland. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had been formed in April 1943 with a specific purpose in mind: to create an elite force of soldiers capable of executing the most demanding missions against Hitler's Fortress Europe. Unlike regular infantry units, Rangers underwent intensive specialized training modeled after the British commandos. The regimen was punishing, scaling sheer cliffs with full combat loads, nighttime infiltration exercises, and close-quarters combat drilling that pushed men beyond normal human endurance. By December 1943, the 2nd Rangers had emerged as perhaps the most lethal small unit formation in the Allied arsenal. What made Peterson's squad distinctive within this already elite unit was their unlikely backgrounds. 4 of the 8 men had civilian experience with electrical engineering or telecommunications. Peterson himself had worked for 3 years installing telephone lines across rural Minnesota before the war. His assistant squad leader, Corporal James Donovan, had been a promising electrical engineering student at MIT before enlisting after Pearl Harbor. Private First Class Robert Alvarez had grown up working in his father's radio repair shop in New Mexico, while Private Thomas Chen had been an apprentice electrician in San Francisco's Chinatown. This unusual concentration of technical expertise had not been planned by any higher headquarters. It was merely one of those accidents of war that would prove fortuitous beyond measure. During the brutal winter training in Scotland, these 4 men began discussing the weaknesses in German defensive positions they had observed in intelligence photos. The images revealed how German machine gun nests along the Norman coast were often positioned in hardened concrete emplacements with excellent fields of fire, but also how they were frequently linked by communication wire to enable coordinated defense. It was Alvarez who first suggested it, Donovan would later recall in a 1972 interview. He said that if we could get to those communication lines, we might be able to do more than just cut them. We might be able to use them. This casual conversation, held during a rare moment of rest between grueling training exercises, would evolve into what the men called the wire trick, a technique officially discouraged by their commanders as too dangerous and unreliable. The premise was elegantly simple in theory, but devilishly complicated in execution. German machine gun positions were typically networked together with field telephone lines to coordinate their fire. These lines used basic copper wire to carry electrical signals. Peterson's squad theorized that if they could locate and tap into these communication wires without being detected, they could use a modified field telephone battery pack to send a massive electrical surge through the system, potentially damaging or disabling the German communication equipment and causing momentary confusion. What they discovered through covert experimentation was far more significant. When tested on captured German equipment, the surge often caused the delicate firing pin mechanisms in their MG-42 machine guns to fuse or jam when the guns were connected to the same circuit as the field telephones, a design vulnerability the Germans had never addressed. The potential of this technique was immediately apparent, but so were the dangers. Any ranger attempting to locate and tap communication wires would be exposed to enemy fire, possibly for extended periods. The electric surge needed to be precisely calibrated. Too weak, and it would fail to disable the German equipment; too strong, and it might alert the enemy to the intrusion before all positions could be neutralized. Most problematic of all, the technique required specialized knowledge to execute properly, knowledge that couldn't easily be taught to other squads in the limited time available. For these reasons, the wire trick remained unofficial, tolerated by some officers who saw its potential, but formally discouraged in training doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, commanding officer of the 2nd Rangers, allegedly told Peterson, "I don't want to know the details, just be ready when the time comes." The time came in early May 1944, when the Rangers received their most closely guarded orders. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions would spearhead the assault on a strategic German artillery position at Pointe du Hoc, a promontory that rose 100 feet above the English Channel between what would become Utah and Omaha beaches. Intelligence indicated that the Germans had installed 6 155mm howitzers capable of raining devastation on both American landing beaches. The Rangers' mission was to scale the cliffs under fire and neutralize these guns before they could devastate the landing forces. What intelligence couldn't precisely map, however, was the intricate network of machine gun positions defending the approach. Aerial reconnaissance had identified at least 8 hardened nests, but ground intelligence from the French resistance suggested the number might be more than double that. As D-Day approached, tension mounted among the Allied High Command. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, expressed grave concerns about the Rangers' chances. "This is the most difficult mission assigned to any unit in the entire invasion," he told his staff on May 30th. "If those machine guns aren't neutralized before our main landing craft approach, we could lose thousands in the first hour." When a Royal Navy commander pessimistically observed that 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing that cliff, Bradley didn't contradict him. The fate of the entire western flank of the invasion might hinge on whether these 225 Rangers could somehow overcome what seemed insurmountable odds. 2 days before the invasion, Peterson requested a private meeting with Captain Ralph Goranson, his company commander. In this meeting, held in the cramped quarters aboard the British transport ship HMS Ben-My-Tree, Peterson formally proposed using the wire trick to neutralize the German machine gun nests before the main Ranger force attempted to scale the cliffs. The plan was audacious. Peterson's squad would land 30 minutes before the main Ranger force, infiltrate the base of the cliff through a narrow gully identified in reconnaissance photos, locate the German communication network, and deploy their modified equipment. If successful, they might neutralize many of the machine gun positions precisely when the main force began their ascent. Goranson was skeptical, but desperate. "You realize this is completely unauthorized," he told Peterson. "If it fails, you've sacrificed your entire squad for nothing, and I'll have to answer for it." Peterson simply nodded. "Sir, my men believe it will work. We've rehearsed it dozens of times. And frankly, what's the alternative? Those MG-42s will cut our boys to ribbons before they get halfway up those ropes." After several minutes of deliberation, Goranson gave his unofficial blessing with a handshake rather than written orders. "You never heard this from me," he said. "Launch time is 0500. Be back at the base of the Western Gully by 0545, or we'll assume you've failed." In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, an unmarked British landing craft carrying Peterson's 8-man squad approached the western edge of Pointe du Hoc. The main Ranger force was still 30 minutes behind them, preparing for their own approach. The sea was rougher than expected, with 5-foot swells that threatened to dash their small craft against the rocks at the base of the cliff. At 5 minutes past 5, the British coxswain, a grizzled Royal Navy veteran who had only been told this was a special reconnaissance, brought them within 30 yards of a narrow, rocky beach. "Closer than this, and we'll be swimming with the fishes," he growled. "Good luck, lads." The Rangers slipped into the frigid water, each man carrying more than 80 pounds of equipment. Alvarez and Chen carried the specialized electrical equipment in waterproof bags, the modified field telephone battery packs, splicing tools, and 300 feet of insulated wire. Donovan carried the squad's only Browning automatic rifle, while Peterson and the remaining 4 men were armed with Thompson submachine guns and extra ammunition. The weight of their equipment pulled them down in the choppy water, and for several terrifying minutes it seemed the mission might end before it began. Private Henry Wilson, the squad's youngest member, at just 19, began to panic as waves crashed over his head. Peterson grabbed him by his harness and physically dragged him the last 15 yards to shore. Upon reaching the narrow strip of beach, the Rangers took cover against the base of the cliff as a German searchlight swept overhead. The beam passed within feet of their position but didn't detect them in the shadows of the rocky outcropping. Soaked to the skin in the 45-degree pre-dawn air, the men waited for 3 agonizing minutes until the searchlight moved on. Peterson then signaled for them to move into a narrow ravine that intelligence had identified as a possible infiltration route. Unlike the sheer face that the main Ranger force would soon attempt to scale, this gully offered a treacherous but navigable path upward for men willing to risk single-file movement. The ascent was painstakingly slow. Each man had to test every handhold and foothold to avoid dislodging rocks that might alert the Germans above. 20 minutes into the climb, Private First Class Michael Donlin froze when his boot dislodged a softball-sized rock that clattered down the ravine. The sound seemed deafening in the pre-dawn stillness, and the squad held their breath for 30 seconds. When no reaction came from above, they continued their ascent with even greater caution. At 5:23, 7 minutes ahead of schedule, Peterson's squad reached a position approximately 30 feet below the cliff top. It was here they encountered their first stroke of luck. Just as intelligence had predicted, a German communication wire bundle ran along a small ledge at this level, connecting various positions around the promontory. Alvarez quickly identified it as standard German field telephone wire, precisely what they had trained to manipulate. Using specialized rubber-handled wire cutters, Chen carefully exposed a section of the line without severing it completely. This was the most delicate part of the operation. They needed to tap into the line without alerting the Germans that their communications had been compromised. As Chen and Alvarez worked to connect their equipment to the German line, the rest of the squad established defensive positions. Donovan set up his Browning automatic rifle to cover their exposed flank, while Peterson and the others prepared to engage any German patrol that might discover them. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. At 5:38, Alvarez whispered, "Connection established. Ready when you are, Sarge." Peterson knew this was the moment of truth. In less than 7 minutes, the main Ranger force would begin their approach to the base of the cliff. By then it would be too late to abort if the wire trick failed. He gave Alvarez a nod, and the young specialist activated the modified battery pack. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, they heard it, confused German voices crackling over the compromised line, followed by what sounded like equipment malfunctions. The surge had worked, traveling through the network to create chaos in the German communication system. What happened next exceeded even Peterson's most optimistic expectations. The electrical surge had not only disrupted communications, but had caused catastrophic failures in the firing mechanisms of multiple MG-42 machine guns connected to the same circuit. They heard frustrated German shouts from at least 3 positions within 50 yards of their location. Without functioning communications, the German defenders couldn't coordinate a response or alert other positions that something was wrong. In the critical minutes that followed, Peterson's squad worked their way along the ledge, identifying additional communication junctions and repeating the process. By 5:45, when they needed to be back at their extraction point, they had managed to compromise 3 separate communication networks. Peterson made the difficult decision to continue the operation rather than return as planned. "If we're going to do this, we do it all the way," he told his men. For 10 more minutes, they moved laterally along the base of the cliff top, locating and compromising additional German communication lines. Each successful tap was followed by distant sounds of confusion and equipment failure. At one point, they clearly heard a German officer shouting for a repair team, unaware that his words were being monitored by the very men causing the disruption. At 5:55, precisely as the main Ranger assault force approached the base of Pointe du Hoc, Peterson's squad had completed their circuit of the promontory. Intelligence had identified 8 probable machine gun positions, but they had compromised the communications to what they estimated were 15 or more emplacements. They had no way of knowing if all the guns had been neutralized, but they had created widespread confusion among the German defenders at the most critical moment of the assault. With their mission accomplished, they made their way back to the extraction point, arriving just as the first rockets fired, grappling hooks up the face of the cliff. What followed would become the stuff of legend. As the main Ranger force began their ascent, they braced for the murderous machine gun fire that intelligence had warned would cost at least 70% casualties. Instead, they faced sporadic, uncoordinated resistance. Of the 18 machine gun positions that should have covered the cliff face, only 3 opened fire, and these did so without the disciplined, interlocking fields of fire that German defenders were known for. The Rangers scaled the cliff in less than 30 minutes, with casualties far below what had been anticipated. Once at the top, they were able to quickly overcome the disorganized German defense and move inland to secure their objectives. When Captain Goranson linked up with Peterson's squad at the rally point atop the cliff, his first words were, "What the hell did you do down there?" Peterson simply handed him the spent battery pack and remaining wire. "Wire trick worked better than expected, sir. We estimate 18 machine gun positions neutralized or compromised." Goranson stared at the simple equipment in disbelief. "My God, Peterson, do you realize what you've done?" The significance wasn't lost on any of them. What should have been a meat grinder had instead become a hard but manageable fight. The contrast with what intelligence had led them to expect was stark. The Rangers had been told to anticipate casualties of up to 80% during the cliff assault phase alone. The actual figure was less than 25% for the entire operation. While many factors contributed to this outcome, including naval gunfire support and the element of surprise, the neutralization of the machine gun nests played a critical role that few outside Peterson's squad fully understood. For security reasons, the full details of how they had compromised the German defenses remained closely held. Official reports attributed the success to effective pre-assault reconnaissance and disruption operations, deliberately vague language that obscured the unauthorized but ingenious method that had been employed. The impact of Peterson's squad's actions extended far beyond that morning. With the Rangers successfully established atop Pointe du Hoc, German counterattacks over the next 2 days were hampered by their compromised communication networks. The invading forces at both Utah and Omaha beaches faced significantly less artillery fire than anticipated as the Rangers prevented the Germans from bringing their heavy guns to bear. By June 8th, when the Ranger position was finally relieved by advancing forces from Omaha Beach, they had held off numerous German counterattacks despite being heavily outnumbered. The technological implications of what Peterson's squad had discovered were not lost on Allied intelligence officers who debriefed them afterward. The vulnerability they had exploited, the susceptibility of German field communications and connected weapon systems to electrical surge attacks, represented a significant weakness in the vaunted German defensive network. Within weeks, specialized teams were being trained to replicate the wire trick with improved equipment and techniques based on Peterson's after-action report. By August 1944, similar operations were being conducted against German defensive positions throughout northern France, albeit with varying degrees of success as the Germans became aware of the vulnerability and began implementing countermeasures. For the men of Peterson's squad, the aftermath was bittersweet. Captain Göransson recommended all 8 men for the Silver Star, but the awards were downgraded to Bronze Stars, with the citations vaguely referencing exceptional courage and resourcefulness in the face of enemy fire. Peterson himself received the Silver Star, but the citation carefully omitted any reference to the wire trick, instead praising his extraordinary leadership during the assault on enemy positions. The psychological impact on the Rangers who scaled those cliffs was profound. Their unauthorized operation had saved countless lives and contributed significantly to the success of the D-Day landings, but the classified nature of their actions meant that public recognition was impossible. Many had mentally prepared themselves for death, having been told repeatedly that their mission was likely suicidal. Instead, they found themselves victorious beyond anyone's expectations. Private First Class John Chester of Easy Company later wrote in his journal, "We were ready to die taking that cliff. When we got to the top and found half the machine guns silent, it was like divine intervention. Some of the guys thought it was a miracle. I guess in a way it was, a miracle of American ingenuity. For the German defenders, the experience was one of bewildering failure." Lieutenant Carl Schmidt, one of the few German officers captured intact at Pointe du Hoc, expressed utter confusion during his interrogation. "Our communications collapsed at the critical moment," he stated through a translator. "Then our machine guns malfunctioned simultaneously. It was as if the Americans had somehow reached inside our defenses before they even arrived." When pressed on how this could have happened, Schmidt had no answers. The German command never fully understood the nature of the vulnerability that had been exploited against them. In the years following World War II, the story of the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc became legendary, celebrated in books, documentaries, and feature films. President Ronald Reagan's 1984 speech commemorating the 40th anniversary of D-Day immortalized the boys of Pointe du Hoc as exemplars of American courage. Yet the full story of how Peterson's squad had changed the equation remained obscured, buried in classified documents, and known only to a handful of participants and high-ranking officers. Not until the declassification of certain Ranger operational records in 1978 did hints of their actions begin to emerge, and even then the technical details remained vague. William Peterson returned to Minnesota after the war, taking up his old profession of installing telephone and electrical lines. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, even to family members. When asked about the Bronze Star medal that hung in a simple frame in his study, he would shrug and say, "Just did what needed doing." He and Alvarez maintained correspondence until Alvarez's death in 1987. Occasionally meeting at Ranger reunions where they would share knowing glances when others spoke about the miracle of Pointe du Hoc. Peterson passed away in 1992, taking many of the technical details of the wire trick with him to the grave. The legacy of what those 8 Rangers accomplished extends beyond military history into the realm of technological warfare. The wire trick represented one of the earliest examples of what would later be called electronic warfare, the deliberate exploitation of an enemy's electronic systems and communications. The techniques they pioneered would evolve into sophisticated military specialties during the Cold War and beyond. Modern electronic warfare specialists, though equipped with far more advanced technology, still employ the fundamental principle that Peterson's squad demonstrated: identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in an adversary's electronic infrastructure. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, was how their actions demonstrated the value of unconventional thinking in warfare. In the rigid hierarchical structure of the military, innovation often struggles against doctrine and procedure. Peterson's squad, by developing and implementing a technique that official channels had discouraged showed that sometimes the most effective solutions come from the bottom up rather than the top down. Their willingness to risk not only enemy fire, but also potential disciplinary action speaks to the initiative and adaptability that would come to characterize American forces throughout the European campaign. The wire trick that silenced 18 German machine guns on D-Day morning represented a perfect storm of circumstances, the right men with the right skills in the right place at the right time. It cannot be replicated precisely, but the principle it embodied, finding unexpected vulnerabilities in seemingly impenetrable defenses, remains as relevant to modern warfare as it was on that fateful June morning in 1944. The 8 Rangers who risked everything on an unauthorized technique saved countless lives and helped secure one of the most critical objectives of the entire D-Day operation. As dawn fully illuminated Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, Sergeant William Peterson gathered his spent equipment and prepared to join the main Ranger force moving inland. Looking out over the English Channel, where thousands of Allied vessels now dotted the horizon, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. What German engineers had spent years constructing, what military intelligence had deemed nearly impregnable, what his own commanders had considered a suicidal objective, all had been overcome through ingenuity, courage, and 300 feet of copper wire. In that moment, as the greatest invasion in military history unfolded before him, a simple farm boy from Minnesota changed the course of the war with a trick that nobody had authorized and few would ever fully understand.